Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Mr. Michael, Dr. Rapici, how are you this evening?
Dr. Barry, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am eager to, it feels like it's been a long time since we did this. I don't know if that's right. I guess it's the usual hiatus, but it feels like we were on a vacation of sorts. I don't know what it is.
No vacation here, sir, but it's been, I think it's, you know what it is, Barry? I think it's that we've taken a little extra time with the content for tonight, and
maybe that's what it is.
We've spent a little more time. What did you just say? Swimming in the waters of philosophy.
Swimming in the waters of philosophy. I suppose we did. But at any rate, I am eager to get down to business. So what's the business, you might be asking? And everyone who's listening to this is asking. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to have a little Steigler detour. And did we promise that we were going to do this? I'm forgetting now. Did we promise that we're going to have or is this totally unannounced and unanticipated in our previous episodes? Are we making a little bit of a detour?
I'm going to just go out on a limb and say that we're making good on promises here.
Yeah, I'm sure we promised this.
I'm sure.
So we're turning to Steigler, an earlier text from Steigler. I think the Steigler text we discussed way back in the prehistoric days of the Critical Media Studies podcast. We discussed volume 2 of the Automatic Society, where Bernard Steigler, the French philosopher Bernard Steigler, was pretty far along on his rethinking of philosophy in light of technology, and in particular, the digital media environment in which, became more and more prominent, let's say after 2005, 6, 7, 8. But we're going to talk a little bit about some sections from a 2010 book from Bernard Steigler, translated by Daniel Ross, called What Makes Life Worth Living on Pharmacology. And I'll also sort of announce this, that one of the things, so we read this, Micah and I read this, and we're happy to talk about it now. We'll try to make sense of it for you and for ourselves. One of the things that we thought we got from our pre-discussion of this and chatting before we started recording, we thought that we were excited by the reading because we felt that Steigler here in this earlier book kind of gives some substance and texture to the idea of the pharmakon, which is a term that and a dynamic and a process and an apparatus that he refers to throughout his work, and also in the Automatic Society, which we've discussed. And God knows it's been a term we've used a lot and dropped a lot in the Critical Media Studies podcast. But we felt that in these opening chapters, in What Makes Life Worth Living, Steigler puts a lot of flesh on the bone. And allowed us to think about the pharmakon and pharmacology, and we'll try and define those terms more in the course of this podcast. Steigler is giving us new ways to sort of think about that problem or problematic. So without any further ado, I will turn to that, I will turn to a fun digression that will help Dr. Mike and Dr. Barry and you, dear listener, sort of get into the mood for learning about the pharmakon and pharmacology. Are we ready?
Yeah, before we jump in,
see, we're not ready. You have
no, we are. I just want
setting. Let's do it.
I just want to make sure that you and I are on the same page here, so that
I'm sure we're not.
So that for everybody listening, that they can be like in the same book at the very least.
Yes.
So
yeah,
we've discussed the pharmakon and have used the term many times.
Yes.
Right. And so just to sort of set groundwork for ourselves here, right?
Let's do it.
When Steigler talks about the plan today is to jump around a little bit in this introductory chapter, and actually to work backwards with his example of the pharmakon.
Oh yeah, yeah. I guess.
And then to discuss how this one thing we haven't talked about that was really new to me in this, and that is the care, right? That he opens with, and the need for taking care, and how that is a part of the pharmakon or a part of pharmacology. But I think that just to make sure, if you haven't heard us go on at length about the pharmakon, what Steigler is talking about in the pharmakon is the poison and the cure, this duality, excuse me, that exists where
In our institution, let's
yes,
add a little bit of a clarifying example to it. No, I love it what you're doing. I'm just adding a little friendly supplement there, that I think the poison and the cure is inevitably in our apparatuses, our teaching institutions, in whatever, right?
yeah,
Right,
and this is one of the
instructional
things.
sites. That's one of the places where that's a major pharmakon where there's a poison and a cure.
What was that? I'm sorry.
uh, that there are many examples of the pharmakon, but one primary example for us, I think, and also for Steigler, is the idea of education. So that in education, in writing practices and reading practices, there is a possibility for a restorative cure, and also something in the very process that poses danger.
Yeah, so this is one of the aspects of this reading that really forced me to step back and reconsider or reconceptualize of the pharmakon. And
Mhm.
you would just mention, the pharmakon can be institutional. It can be, we had talked about this the other day. It seems to me that he's framing it as potentially even a process.
Sure, absolutely.
Um, it's certainly as a thing, right? So we have talked about the internet, for example, as a pharmakon.
That's a problem.
But I think that what's really interesting is that the way that this discussion goes is that it's not necessarily a discrete thing that serves us well and then extracts a cost. It is much bigger than that, in the sense that we could, and I think so. I kind of want to get your take before we jump into the actual text on how you understand the distinction and why there needs to be a distinction between the pharmakon and a pharmacology.
Well, I'm going to answer that by introducing another term.
Okay.
And I'm going to introduce this other term to maybe fill out our definition, our working definition of the pharmakon. And then there I'll see if I remember these things, and I'll move to the pharmacology. But let's use another word that hopefully will be even more of a clarifying example. I mentioned about institutions, and you mentioned the internet, but let's use the word that he uses, technics.
Right.
Any technics. And technics also is a term that requires glossing, but let's just say that it's technology plus. But for our purposes, we'll amplify it, but for our purposes, we'll go crude now, and we'll say that Steigler means by techniques not just technology, but technology will do for our purposes. Any technology can be a pharmakon. So the digital media, the internet, of course, as a technics, as a tool that humans use that changes consciousness, and it's actually in the transform, any techniques has a transformative effect on humans. And that, my dear friend, Dr. Michael Rapici, is the pharmacon. The techniques, humans interacting with technology, with techniques in the broad sense, transforms humans for good and for bad. That's the pharmacon. That's about as good as I can do for a definition. And then what's a pharmacology? you need a pharmacology in the same way you need a pharmacist. If you got drugs, you want to know what drugs are good, how much dosage you need. So why this is a pharmacology is that if pharmakons are what we have, if technics present us with a pharmakon, then we damn well better become pharmacologists. We better develop a pharmacology, i.e., we better become pharmacists. Does that make sense? You're looking at me quizzically. No, you're
It
thinking,
does, but
no.
so I'm gonna do what I do here, and that is maybe complicate this a little unnecessarily. And I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but I think this is sort of an important set of understandings to have for us. And I think and I also want to sort of offer a little grace here and say that I think that due to the inherently unstable nature of these terms, there is, I think there's room for slightly differing understandings, and this still can work. So I think about this, and this is something that came to me last night after we'd spoken. We're talking about the pharmakon and how it's sort of a process that changes. And, as you just mentioned, that it asserts a change. And I mentioned actor network theory, which we've talked about beforehand, and how you have, and again, we've done a couple of really interesting episodes, or I found them interesting anyways, episodes on this. So I'm not trying to redo those, but the idea that you have a group of actors in socialization or in relation to each other, and the nature of those relations produce certain networks, which are then able to do certain things and able to not do things. I kind of think of the pharmakon and pharmacology in the same way, that these techniques and the ways in which we're arranged with them bring out the poisonous nature at times and allow for the cure for the nature at times. And I think that as these things, as we're sort of always evolving with our technology, we're always in a state of change, right? That I sort of understood the notion of pharmacology as like the ecology of our pharmacon. I don't know if that's too simplistic, but the way that we are arranged in a way becomes a pharmacology. And I don't know that that's different than what you're saying, but I'm just trying to, before we start talking about fire and care, I think it's important to sort of understand the thought that underpins this a little bit.
Shall I comment, or
Yeah, no, I'm done. I'm done.
I don't think there's anything. I think, as you were saying before, there's a lot of room here. In fact, that's one of the things that's interesting us, right? This is one of the reasons why we're interested in this particular text, and that we're thinking about, we're expanding our ideas. He's expanding our idea with the pharmakon. So I don't think there's any real tension or contradiction between, well, I would say, I think both our readings, I like your reading and I like my reading, and I don't think there's any contradiction between them. But I would say this. I think there is a tension and a difference, and I'm going to see if I can articulate it before we go on. I'm going to see if I can articulate what I sense is a difference between what you just said and what I was saying when I was saying pharmakons need pharmacists. I think I was doing my Heidegger / weird ass humanist reading of the pharmakon. And you were doing, as you were kind of saying, your ant theory of the pharmakon. I think both of them are correct. So your ant reading of the pharmakon, you're interested, and what you most notice about the dynamic of the pharmakon as Steigler lies out. I was noticing in your definition, you're talking about the ways in which the apparatus itself, the pharmakon itself, is producing the poison or the cure, right? That's a very object-oriented reading of the pharmakon. And I think especially in this particular text, since he opens with an object, with basically an object-oriented psychoanalyst, D.W. Winnicott, that's certainly right here in the book, so like I said, I'm an unreconstructed Heideggerian. And so I am thinking about philosophy as a therapy. And so that's why I don't think about objects, I think about humans, and I think about therapies. And which is another component of the book, right? Because that's the interest in psychoanalysis too. So I was thinking about, well, if you have a pharmakon, you need a pharmacist. Or everybody needs to become their pharmacist. So again, I was sort of pushing it toward the human, and you were pushing it toward object-oriented ontologies.
Huh? Okay, yeah, I see that. I don't think that those two are in.
Did you make a crack about my humanism, or is that what you were doing there?
No, I wouldn't do that. All right, so I think that's good. Shall we start talking about?
Yeah, we shall. But I mean, are you okay with that, or is there more?
No, perfectly. I think what I like. Let me just say this. I guess what I like about this idea is one. Obviously, it's got legs. It works. But what I really like about it is that it's adaptable. You can be. What did you call yourself? An unreconstructed Heideggerian, right? And I can be an ant fanboy, and we can still play with the same toys.
Let's still talk.
And let's still be friends, Barry.
Yeah, well, we're still going to be friends, which is in the spirit of this particular book, because that's what makes life worth living, quote unquote.
Good God. Okay.
Dr. Rapici. Okay. I'm going to cut to the chase, and let's go to the fire example. How about we do that? Or do you want me to?
No, I think in this case, so
let's just move to the fire example. Yeah.
What Barry is talking about here is it towards the end of the chapter, Steigler talks about.
Should I read? You want me?
Well, yeah, I'm just going to just
set it up.
I'll set it up real quick. So what he's talking about is at the end of the chapter, Steigler talks about the fire of Prometheus as the example of the pharmakon par excellence, and his words,
good.
right?
Very good.
And he actually begins the chapter with a discussion of care and transitional space, and he uses motherhood,
and maternal care,
maternal care as the example. And we have decided that it actually makes more sense now that we've talked about the pharmakon a bit. I think it makes more sense to start with the fire as a concrete example of what it is, and in a very non-Stiglerian move, work the other way in terms of unpacking the example rather than setting up the example.
Okay, I'm going to read, and you're going to stop me when I go too far. I am tempted to go, and I'm looking at 24 and 25 of this edition. I think it's the only one you can find in 2010 if you're following at home. But Michael, I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'm tempted to go to page 25, but you stop me if you feel. Okay.
Hey, I'm fine. We're good.
You're going to interrupt my reading, Jag, is what I'm saying. So I'm empowering you. Okay, we're ready.
Good. Here we go.
We're ready. Fire is the pharmakon par excellence, Steigler writes. As civilizing process, it is constantly at risk of setting fire to civilization. As the emblem common to technics and desire, it constitutes and articulates a dual logic of the necessary default. I'm skipping the part in the middle there and resuming to that next paragraph. And maybe I'll stop there. I was tempted to go to page 25, but maybe we're going to be able to make sense of this passage by itself. Okay, fire, pharmakon par excellence. It is constantly a risk of setting fire to civilization. Fire is an emblem that both represents technics and desire. And then he continues about technics. Technics, which thus pharmacologically constitutes the default insofar as it forms the horizon of desire, simultaneously opens two antagonistic yet inseparable paths, that of the drives and that of sublimation. Okay, I think we can do it. Maybe we're just using this paragraph and say, okay, I'll start and then you help me, okay? So what he's saying here, this is what I'm glad you made us, set the stage, because this is kind of how we were setting the stage at the very beginning. We said that technology, is an example of the pharmakon. And what the pharmakon consists of, there's a constitutive tension in the pharmakon of technics, in the technics/pharmakon, that he defines as such. Technics is always about desire, and that desire can be a fire that destroys civilization. And at the same time, technics, the pharmakon, makes possible sublimation, a restraining, a controlling, a disciplining of the drives. That's what he seems to work through here by using fire. So let's think of fire as a technics. Fire is something that if one does not take care to restrain, first off, technics, fire is a tool for human desire.
Right.
Right. It always gratifies a human need, a human desire. If untended, it can destroy the area, including humans.
Right.
On the other hand, he's saying, just because fire has that destructive tendency doesn't mean that's the definition of the pharmakon. The pharmakon actually is that which both can potentially destroy, but also it offers, I'm going to use Heideggerian language since I'm an unreconstructed Heideggerian. Fire also affords a clearing, a space by which humans can take care of the pharmakon and sublimate their desires.
Right. So I want to look at his phrasing here again. Technics which thus pharmacologically constitutes the default insofar as it forms the horizon for desire simultaneously opens two antagonistic yet inseparable paths, that of the drives and that of sublimation, right?
Yeah, and the horizon is the clearing I was talking about. That's his word for it, and I'll use that. The horizon, the pharmakon, technics, is the horizon, and in that horizon, there is the destructive impulse, there's the desire, the potentially overwhelming desire, and then there's the sublimation of desire.
So technics constitutes the default insofar as it forms the horizon of desire. This is essentially what is possible, what can be done, what needs to be done. This is that starting point that it doesn't really, the interesting thing about all of this, and he makes this claim, is that none of this actually exists as a space, right? This is sort of, because we're always we're always engaged with these things. And so he's talking about that horizon as sort of a pre-existing state.
Sure. But it's important, but metaphors are necessary. So horizon is a metaphor.
Right.
Clearing the Heidegger thing very consciously, that's a metaphor. It makes us think of space. But yes, you're right to say that we have to think about this spatially, but it doesn't really exist in a place. No.
So let me ask a question here, because this is and I don't mean to be pedantic with this, but I think this might be an interesting question to poke at for a second. He sets this up that there is a tension, right, between drive and sublimation. And he says that these two, his words again, simultaneously opens two antagonistic yet inseparable paths.
That's that pharmakon.
But what makes them antagonistic? Is it not possible that does sublimation always have to be antagonistic to desire, to the drive?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well,
Try that again.
so let's, as I'm understanding this, right?
Quick answer, but I don't think this is your question. That's why I'm asking you to formulate it. I mean, the quick answer to what you're saying is that, well, why are these things always opposed? Well, they're contraries. They're contraries, they're necessarily opposed. But I don't sense that's your question.
No, so if the pharmakon is, and we'll use fire, or let's use like a thing here, right? Fire's fine as an example. There
He
is
says it's I think we
the
have to
ideal
stick with
example,
fire because he says it's the par excellence example.
right?
So we better stick with it. Yeah.
So it is this thing that is loaded with potential,
There we
right?
are.
And there's the potential for good, right? We can cook, we can warm ourselves, we can use this to advance future technologies, right? Like there is a lot of very clearly positive good. The curative aspect of fire is clear, right? The poison in fire, equally clear, right? It is profoundly destructive, it is profoundly dangerous, right? So it's one and the same. But and so when he's talking about this antagonistic yet inseparable, right? At the same time, if we just substitute the pharmakon as opposed to if we just take the pharmakon as a whole and drop it in here, right? We see these two tensions. I guess my question, better framed, is the antagonism between the poison and the cure
The
always
destructive and the constructive. The destructive
must it always be tense, right? Because, or does that not make sense?
No, go ahead.
That's so as I'm watching things.
Must there always be? I'm back to what I said earlier. I mean, how do you not have an opposition between contraries?
Well, this is so to make it extreme, and I could just be sounding like an absolute idiot this evening, and that's fine. I'll wear it. As I'm watching Rome burn, right? I'm not sitting there thinking, boy, it is really comfortable and toasty right where I'm standing, right? Like the poisonous aspect of that absolutely overruns the cure in that moment. Fair? And simultaneously, if I've got a fire in the fireplace.
We're silly tonight because I want to stop you right there. Isn't the paradox of the pharmakon that I could indeed enjoy? I mean, in fact, we talk about this all the time, right? In our common, right? Aren't there people who like to burn things just because they want to see it burn?
So if that's the question,
couldn't I indeed be enjoying?
Okay.
Being
Well, then
delighted and warmed by the fire that is destroying my city?
You could. But then this question brings up is pharmacologically, or is the pharmacology, or is the pharmakon a relative term then? Is your poison my cure? I mean, like I'm
No. Well, I don't think. Well, first off, I certainly hope not, because if we're just getting this term so that we can say, "Oh, I got a pharmakon, and you got a pharmakon, and it's a different pharmakon, and we all got our own pharmakons," I'm going to throw this book down the toilet. But I don't think that's what he's saying. And in fact, I would say that pharmakon, and as an unreconstructed Heideggerian, I would definitely try to flush the book down the toilet. But I don't think that's what's going on here. And so I'm going to use another term besides horizon and besides clearing, which he uses, which I'm going to use a Heideggerian term, but I think it's very much in keeping with the terms that are being used here in the English translation, and I'm assuming in the original French. I'm going to use the word ground. So he's talking about the ground, the pharmakon, the fire, insofar as it is a pharmakon, insofar as it's a technics. It's the ground on which negativity and positivity grow. So in a way, let's go back and try to answer your first question with that, using the metaphor of the ground, another spatial metaphor, but maybe a more helpful one in this case. If it's the ground, then it's not necessarily determining destruction, construction, generation. It's irrelevant to talk about these as opposing terms of the ground.
Right.
The ground enables both. But if it's the ground, if it's the foundation, then it's not a relative observation. It's not a relative phenomenon. I feel he's talking about, as Heidegger was, capital B being.
Right.
So that's my take, I think, on both of your questions.
And I think he addresses this if you were to have ventured over to page 25.
Why don't you venture? Go venture.
He says, and just as melancholy is essentially the fact of dependence, as Freud, do you see this in the middle of the page?
Why don't you read it?
Okay, so it's 2 paragraphs from the bottom here.
Okay.
And he says, just as melancholy is essentially the fact of dependence, as Freud teaches, so too the pharmakon becomes a poison when it provokes dependence.
There we are.
And so, but then he goes on. He says, so how do you say this? Heteronomy. That is the loss of autonomia.
Autonomia.
As Phaedra says, atrophied by writing, memory can no longer go without its hyponymation. But as we shall see,
you're a brave mofo to be reading this paragraph. I'm admiring you. Go for it, man.
As we shall see, there is no autonomy other than as the adoption of heteronomy, that is, of a pharmakon, so that dependence opens a milieu that Winnicott had called transitional space. So
ground. I think all those things, transitional space, openings, we're talking about grounds. Yeah. Foundations.
So
no, so to answer, I think very clearly that is answering your first question. It's not like there's a dialectic ready. I mean, the dialectic happens on top of the ground, right? The ground is affording the dialectic. So there isn't, I think we're actually talking about being, the being that is pre-exists heteronomy, autonomy, any opposites you care to name.
I guess the reason I ask the question is in the beginning when he's talking about care and maternal care, right? The things that the mother will do to care for her child, that bring them together, that create the bond, which in that moment is the cure, right? This space which becomes a pharmakon.
We have to say that Michael is referring to, we've jumped from the end of chapter 1 to the very beginning of the book and we're talking now about the maternal care metaphor that Steigler is taking from psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott in order to sort of explain the pharmakon.
So maybe we'll make that jump now, but I can.
No, you go ahead. I just
well, the question I have is that
you're talking about a different part of the text.
Right. And maybe this is our segue to moving into that part of the discussion, but I can still finish this. I think if you're still listening along, this will still make sense, right? So the mother's behavior towards the child is the cure. It's the thing that nurtures the child, brings the child together, but it nurtures a dependence, which then becomes constraining. And so my question is really, when I ask about that tension, so much of the pharmakon, and you're even sort of semi-sarcastic, I hope, question about feeling warmed by the flames as your city burns, right? Is it's still perspective. And, I guess what I'm asking here is I'm wondering if there's...
I very strongly disagree with that. You're saying that's just my perspective.
Not your perspective, not your perspective.
Oh, yeah.
It is the perspective of the person in this little, I'm going to go back to my networks here for a second. Okay. If I'm arranged in relation to a pharmakon in a certain way and it's offering me a cure. Okay. and then the network is reconfigured.
Mhm.
The nature of the pharmakon remains unchanged, but from a different perspective, it becomes the poison. So if you think about a super, a loving mother, right, who creates this nurturing moment for a child, but then as the child goes, that mother is still loving. If that love doesn't change, right, that transitional space, this pharmacological moment, if you will,
Mhm.
now becomes a poison. It
Mhm.
becomes a burden. And
Mhm.
so perspective is maybe our orientation to the pharmakon.
Mhm.
What I'm getting at is if we say that the pharmakon contains both the poison and the cure, the
Yes.
fire contains the poison and the cure. The
Mhm.
fire just knows to burn, right? That's all that
Oh,
it
absolutely. Right. Right.
does.
Right.
It's our orientation to it
Absolutely.
that is
That's
going
care.
to,
Care is the orientation.
okay, we got to slow down
Care
and get
or
to that
lack of
moment.
care. Care or lack, but I think that's important. And we're saying
Yes.
care. I mean, because it is your word. I mean, you're right. He is invoking your word, and the way in which he expresses the orientation is primarily through care. Lack of, and of course, care could be, you could be careless too, right?
Right.
Right. Lack of care or carefulness. Care is that is the name of the orientation that you're talking about.
It's attention is
Indeed,
another,
indeed.
right? So
Indeed,
how
indeed.
we,
Indeed,
okay.
indeed. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's worth mentioning.
Okay. Well, shall we jump to the beginning?
Well, you know what I'm hoping as we go we're going to jump to the beginning. Now, I'm hoping that when I read, after all this discussion, when I read this, we're going to have this warm, fuzzy feeling inside and the satisfying feeling, and that we can move to a close.
I think maybe we can.
That's what I'm hoping, that we have tied up already. We've tied up enough loose ends that once I read this, we're going to be able to wrap up this episode. We'll see, but here we go. Now we're going to go to the beginning. And is this right after? I think it is immediately following the discussion of the mother and child.
This is,
All the things that Michael was referring
for
to.
those of you reading along at home, this is actually this is the end of the introduction.
End of the introduction, page 4. All right, so I will commence. The pharmakon is at once what in oh, Michael, I think this is going to work. I'm getting a little
Terrifying to think so, but here we go.
The pharmakon is at cue our discussion of fire. Just rewind the podcast a couple of minutes ago. All right. Here's what Steigler writes at the head of the study. The pharmakon is at once what enables care to be taken and that of which care must be taken.
So it's
in the sense, let's continue, because you also used this word a moment ago.
okay.
In the sense that it is necessary to pay attention. Colon, no, not colon.
Yep, colon.
Or colon. Its power is curative to the immeasurable extent dans les mesures et les mesures. It's not anywhere near French.
I don't even think that was French,
Let me go
but
back. Let me go back. In the sense that it is necessary to pay attention. That's in italics in the text. Its power is curative to the immeasurable extent. Interesting, immeasurable extent, right? Immeasurable extent, and that's why they're quoting the French, because the French is suggesting it's an extent that cannot be truly measured, right? That is also potentially destructive in italics. That's the pharmacon, right? That's what we've been talking about.
so the way that he's framing it here is the pharmakon becomes an object. It is the thing that what does he say? That it enables care to be taken and that of which care must be taken.
That's great. I mean, that and that actually does fit the later fire metaphor perfectly.
Right. And he goes on, he says this at once. So the pharmakon is at once what enables. The at once characterizes what I call the pharmacology. So that is the nature of our interactions with them. So again, as we started, kind of blissfully inattentive to this little phrase here, I think we both got room there.
Yeah, I think so. And you know what? I told Michael this. Initially, I was going to, but I'm much happier that Michael did what he did, which is make us sort of work through pharmacology, and try to give some texture to and some substance to these, difficult to understand concepts. But initially I wanted to read the epigraphs that Steigler begins the text with, which I glanced over before I read and made no sense to me. But then after reading, they make a lot of sense to me. And I won't read all four, but I think I can close out by reading the first one. So Michael, can you turn with me to the very beginning, right after the acknowledgements page? How about you do it? If you can, how about you read the very first epigraph?
So Socrates
in Plato's
Phaedo says, "Do not be careless."
Everything hinges on the idea that one takes care.
Right.
Like that's the fundamental, that first epigram, in a sense, is the whole book. That to have a pharmacology, you should not be careless.
In every sense of the word.
In
every sense of the word. And so that notion of care, I kind of want to unpack, actually, as I'm looking at these. I want to unpack a couple more, because, and I don't want to kick a dead horse, but this idea of, again, the space between the poison and the cure. At the end, which was really our beginning, Steigler mentions that it comes down to a dependence, right? What's odd is that this notion of care has an implication of attending to things, whether they be, emotional needs, or whether they be more practical, pragmatic sort of needs about things. So it's this weird, if I was a better linguist, I'd be able to play, I'm sure, with attendance and dependence a little more effectively. But this gets back to this next one. Excuse me. Let me jump to the second one, and we can go here. The second one says, "Living itself is a therapy that makes sense." This seems to be very much in your sort of human mold here.
The pharmacy.
Right.
The pharmacist knows how to pay attention to the drug and therefore can prescribe.
But so there again, the term therapy is a loaded.
Absolutely.
In the sense that it is the medicine and the process. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the big takeaway for me is that before we started with this, I had conceived of the pharmakon as a discrete thing, that even if you want to take something as far reaching as the internet, for example, my initial example, it is still okay. So we are recovering from some technical difficulties here that saw the entire thing crash. So just to finish up real quick, my takeaway, I was talking about the fact that prior to reading this, I had always conceived of the pharmakon as a discrete thing that exhibited properties that were both, beneficial and what's my word?
And negative.
And negative, right? There was the poison and the cure.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that this has really changed for me, Barry, is I see the pharmakon as being much more sort of entwined into the societies that we have, the cultures that we have, rather than discrete things. I think this is sort of where we had started. Like, I see them as processes and institutions. So it's an interest. I think it just broadens the scope of it. I don't know that it fundamentally changes anything, It just makes it a much more, if I go back to the network, rather than looking at a particular actor as a network, in a network as a pharmakon, you can now potentially see the network itself functioning in that place without disrupting the idea in any meaningful way.
And for me, what I'm now seeing a kind of formula, or working with a kind of formula, that goes something like this: that technics equals pharmakon. No, I'll start again. Technics equals culture equals pharmakon. That there's a way in which, maybe I could even add more terms to it, but I don't think I need to, but there's a way in which there are certain equivalences, certain components of the pharmakon, which is another way of saying what you're saying. I'm seeing certain components of the pharmakon that were not clear in my understanding before, that have been enabled by this text. What Makes Life Worth Living by Bernard Steigler.
Care.
That's my takeaway. Care. Wow. Yes, care. That's it. We're done. Let's wrap this up.
So I think we just really broke the internet, because that's a big question out there, and we just answered it. So
Care.
You're welcome. Well, Barry, this was interesting. This was exciting, and
and eventful. Behind the scenes.
The behind the scenes was much more eventful.
Trust me, it's eventful.
So thank you, and we'll get at this again soon.
Take care, sir. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.